In this demonstration, we are going to take a look at the use of anonymous methods within your C# programs. An anonymous method is like almost any other method, except it doesn't have a traditional method signature, such as a return type, the method name, and the parameter list. Instead, it's typically just the parameter list that is attached directly to an event or a delegate or used within the context of functional programming. First, let's take a look at traditional event handling. If we have a form with this test button 1 button on it and we want to handle its click event, we would double click on this button and it will generate this test button underscore 1 click event handler, to which we can put in a call to message box show, and print a message such as test button 1 was clicked. When we run this application then, we can click test and you will see the message box is displayed. Now, the process of creating a specific method to do this work can be considered a bit tedious, especially since this method is only ever going to be invoked as a result of clicking the button. This is not a method that we are likely to call directly from any other part of the code. To that end, what we could do is bypass the creation of this formal method and use an anonymous method instead. I will go back to Form1CS and I will create another button by copying and pasting the first one. I'll change the text to test2 and I'll call the button test button 2. Instead of double clicking on this to handle the click event, I am going to manually attach to that event by typing in test_button2.click, and then I will add to it a new delegate method. This is going to be an on-the-fly delegate, and it will have object, sender, and event args_e as the input parameters. I know that just because the click event is a standard event handler, as you can see here on the IntelliSense pop-up. So it'll be object sender and event args_e as the parameter list. We can also see that here in the event handler that we formerly created. This is now an anonymous code block, or anonymous method code block, and it must be terminated with a semicolon. Notice here if I leave the semicolon out, it will complain. And then everything between these curly braces represents the exact same type of functionality you would get within a methods or a formal methods curly braces. So I could, in fact, just copy that code here and say message box.show test button 2 was clicked. Now when I run, if I click test 2, you will in fact see test button 2 was clicked. So we bypass the need to have this formal method definition. This is probably not recommended for large blocks of code, like if you have to do many operations like loading from a database, manipulating data, and resaving to a database. That is probably still best left to a formal method, because you'll probably want to call that in multiple ways, not necessarily just from a buttons click event. You may need to call those methods based on any number of scenarios. Event-driven programming can be tricky in that way because there is not always just one path that the code will execute to get you to a particular block of code. An interesting feature about anonymous methods is that it can access variables defined outside of its definition, but inside the method where it's actually attached. So as you can see here, we're in the constructor of form 1, and we're defining the anonymous method here by attaching it to the click event of test button 2. If I were to declare a variable, we'll just call it test, just type string, and I give it ABC as its internal text, I am actually able to access that outer variable within this anonymous method. So this test, you can see when I clicked on it, it highlighted this test and it highlighted the source where it's coming from. I can run this. You can see test button 2 is clicked. Now this brings up a very interesting scenario, because when you consider this method, this form 1 constructor, completed executing long before we actually triggered this anonymous method, it makes you wonder how this variable is still hanging around. Well, the compiler recognizes that this anonymous method is utilizing a variable declared outside of it. So what it will do is it will handle this test variable very specifically, such that it will stay around long enough for it to be usable by this particular anonymous method. But what happens if we do something like this? Int x equals 1. And then besides test, we'll print x. And for fun, we'll augment x as well. So that means we're possibly going to click this button several times. So will x remain 1 for every one of the tests, or will it be augmented? So I'll click test 2. Here it is as a 1. Click it again. It's a 2. Click it again, and now it's a 3. So as I said, it keeps that variable around long enough for it to be used by this anonymous method. And since this anonymous method can be triggered at any time while the form is still active, this variable x and the variable test will stick around for the entire time this form is available. Now that can be a good or a bad thing. You have to understand that this will increase the memory footprint of your application, very slightly in this case because it's only a single string and an int. But if this anonymous method is accessing many different variables and they're large, those variables will also have to remain active for the entire time this form is active. It's almost like we took these variables and instead of declaring them within form 1, we moved them to the field level of the form itself. And in fact, it does have the same effect on memory. I'll return them back to their original position. Again, this is one of those techniques that you may not use a great deal because it has its very specific applications. However, when you start working with functional programming, and that will find its way into your day-to-day code, then this technique becomes more important. You won't necessarily see it within the terms of attaching it to an event such as this, but it will look and feel very similar, and it is a technique, like I said, you will be using much more frequently as you become more advanced with the C# language.